Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Graham Coleman. I'm a senior accessibility consultant at the PASIL Group, and I have Ian Pouncey with me as the other moderator for this session. And we're delighted to present a talk today by David Swallow from the University of York.
Pouncey with me, the other moderator.
Oops, we've got a bit of echo there.
Delighted to present a talk today by David Swallow.
And so what we're going to do now is we'll shortly hand over to David, but if you've got any questions for David during the session, please ask him on Twitter using the hashtag ID24. But apart from that, it's basically... Well, and also we've got captions that are linked to from the YouTube description as well. So I think that's everything I need to say. So basically over to David, if you just start sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thanks, Graham. Okay, is that working? Yep, okay. Okay, so my name, as Graham said, is David Swallow, and I'm a researcher in human-computer interaction at the University of York. And for almost the last decade, I've been working on various research projects in which I design and develop and evaluate usable and accessible interactive technologies. And we do sort of various work in the research group, but we're particularly interested in web accessibility and design for people with disabilities and also older adults. Prior to this, I used to be a web developer for a small software company, and here I was responsible for designing and developing websites for clients in the property business, so estate agents, realtors, who were a delightful bunch of people. When I think back, this is where I first came across the concept of web accessibility, and sort of did the rest of banging the drum about it then. And then this background in web development has stuck with me, and it's influenced my current research. And for the last 6 years, I've been doing a part-time PhD in computer science. And I'm investigating why professional web developers are struggling to build accessible websites, and how we can integrate accessible web development practices into their existing workflows. So this sort of was drawn upon my experience both as a researcher and a web developer. So I thought I'd just give you an overview really of my research and what I've been doing. It's not going to be a very technical, very practical talk, but there's going to be plenty of that in today's session. So it should be particularly interesting to web developers and practitioners, I hope, but hopefully it'll be of interest to everyone. So it's in two parts. The first is a sort of bit of background to my research, and then what I've actually been doing. I should point out the research is still ongoing. I'm currently writing it up, so I would really value any feedback or any questions you might have. Okay, so enough about me. Oh, there we go. That was my brief intro. So I'm going to start this off by looking at what has been done about web accessibility. So obviously, web accessibility has always been a challenge, and there's been numerous attempts to tackle this challenge. I'm just going to provide a very brief potted history of that. So it all starts with the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, the web's governing body, the main international standards organisation for the web, in 1994. 3 years later, in 97, the W3C formed the WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative, to try and improve the accessibility of the web for people with disabilities. 2 years after that, there's the first version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. They were published. And at a similar time, a year earlier in '98, Section 508 was published, and that required US federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. And Section 508 was legally enforceable in the US, so that became an important benchmark. Now, with WCAG being pretty much first off the block, it was incorporated into lots of legal documents, local standards, specific guidelines, and became the de facto standard for web accessibility guidelines. There were numerous criticisms at the time. It sort of soon became out of step with technologies. It was too focused on proprietary technologies, and it hadn't been validated with actual users. So in December 2008, almost a decade later, WCAG 2 was published, and this was a lot more up to date. However, I think it's fair to say it's quite difficult to interpret. And to address that problem of being too technology specific, it attempts to be technology agnostic, and as a result, it can be more general in places but very specific in others, and it's quite difficult for anyone without a good grounding in web accessibility to understand. Other things, in 2010, the UK Equality Act came into force in England, Scotland and Wales. Made it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. So anyone providing a service, public and private and voluntary service. So if anyone with a disability couldn't access information on a website, then it could be seen as discrimination. And similarly, in the US, there was a 2011 update to the Americans with Disabilities Act that required all businesses in the US serving the public, whether the storefront or the web, to meet the ADA accessibility guidelines. So over the last 15, 16, 17 years, there have been various initiatives to support, to encourage, and sometimes to legally compel web developers to improve the accessibility of websites for disabled people. Has it made much of a difference, though? So in parallel to these initiatives, there have been lots of studies that sort of try and attempt to take a measure of the current state of web accessibility, and they usually pick a selection of websites, often the most popular websites, but sometimes it's a particular sector like the government or libraries or something like that. And then they evaluate the websites using various methods, automatic, manual testing, sometimes user testing, and often following various guidelines, usually WCAG. And then they present a benchmark of web accessibility. So just quickly run through a few of these. In 2000, Sullivan and Matson looked at the accessibility levels in 50 of the web's most popular sites, and only 18% of those were accessible. Stowers, 2002, looked at the accessibility of 148 US federal websites, and only 13.5% were accessible. The Disability Rights Commission in 2004, they commissioned a landmark investigation of 1,000 UK websites from government, business, e-commerce, entertainment, and they did automatic testing, manual testing, and user testing, and 81% of the home pages failed to achieve the lowest level of accessibility compliance. 2005, the UK Cabinet Office published a report on the accessibility of government online services across the European Union, and only 3% of the 436 public service websites achieved WCAG 1 level A. None of them achieved level AA. Skipping over a few, Olalere, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, and Lazar. They looked at the accessibility of 100 US federal home pages to determine their compliance with Section 508, and over 90% had serious accessibility violations. So I hope I haven't laboured that point too much, but yeah, this is only the tip of the iceberg. I'm currently sort of putting together a systematic review of the web accessibility evaluation literature from the last 15 years or so, which is over 300 papers so far, just to try and show a clearer pattern of what is happening. I'm still analysing these papers, but the early indications suggest that despite the introduction of various guidelines over the last decade and these growing legal requirements to implement them, the accessibility of websites is not getting any better, and in certain cases it's actually getting worse. Okay, so whose fault is this? Where does the responsibility lie? So there are obviously various stakeholders involved in creating and maintaining accessible websites. You might have the person or the organization that commissioned the website. You've got the content providers, web designers who might provide, the graphical, stylistic input, web accessibility experts, operating system, browser and assistive technology providers, web and accessibility standards groups, and possibly more. But I would argue that the stakeholder group with the greatest influence on whether a website is accessible or not is web developers, because to a large extent they sort of mediate all this and they integrate everyone's inputs by actually creating and coding the website itself. So I'm not alone in thinking this. Numerous studies have considered web developers to have the most responsibility, and I've spoken to a lot of web developers who feel that themselves, but I'm aware that not everyone feels that way. So just a question to throw out there, do you agree? Who do you feel is most responsible for web accessibility of all the stakeholders? Obviously, I'm most interested in web developers, and I'm not alone in looking at this. And various authors have suggested reasons for why websites are not accessible. Lazar, Dudley, Sponogle, and Greenidge in 2004 proposed a web accessibility integration model, and it had the aim of highlighting the various influences on the accessibility or inaccessibility of a website. And this provides quite a useful framework from which to hang the various causes of poor accessibility. So it includes three sort of main strands. The first one is called Societal Foundations, and this just refers to education and training in web accessibility, and also policy and law relating to web accessibility. And they also refer to the impact of shocking accessibility statistics upon web accessibility. Okay, so that's their first influence on web accessibility. The second sort of theme is stakeholder perceptions, as they call it, and that refers to the attitudes of the stakeholders and the people involved in developing a website. And Lazar argues that if none of the groups that are involved are aware or passionate about web accessibility, then the resulting website is unlikely to be accessible. And then the third kind of strand is web development, and that refers to the direct influences upon web developers, such as guidelines and tools, which will affect the initial web design as well as ongoing management and redesign. So Lazar argues that the guidelines and tools not only provide guidance to web developers, but provide the current working definition of web accessibility. And they say good, well-written guidelines and powerful software tools are likely to improve levels of accessibility. Poorly written, confusing guidelines and hard to use or unclear software tools are likely to keep sites from becoming accessible. Okay, so there is obviously a host of factors, host of influences on the accessibility of websites, education, law and policy, etc. As I approached my PhD research, there was little I could do about some of these broader concerns, but the tools and the guidelines was something I could perhaps look at and do something about. So in my PhD, I've been investigating why web developers are struggling to make websites accessible and how we could improve accessibility support to them. Okay, so that was the background to the research. So here is what I actually did. So first I decided to go back to basics, try and get a better understanding of web developers and why they're struggling to create accessible websites. To do this, I used a technique called contextual inquiries, which you may be familiar with. It's not a million miles away from an interview, but it involves observing interviewees conducting their own work in their own work environments, including a Starbucks in this case. So you sit with them, they start doing their actual work, and then you start shadowing them and you're observing them and asking questions and taking notes and following them around and monitoring who they interact with, generally just being nosy, really. It sounds like it could be really irritating, really, but it's not in practice. But it wasn't for me. I didn't feel that way. So I conducted contextual inquiries with 13 professional web developers from the UK, Ireland, and Italy. And they had a range of experience. Some worked for large enterprises, some worked for small and medium enterprises. One participant was a self-employed freelancer, and that was who I met in the Starbucks, which was where he was working. So this study generated masses of data, who web developers interact with, workplace cultures, the procedures they go through, even the layout of their desks and offices and the objects they use. But I think really the takeaway message from this is that web developers do appear to be genuinely interested in making their websites accessible. Lack of awareness, lack of concern was not a problem. But it was a lack of knowledge and a lack of practical guidance that was a problem. And it was clear that the tools and guidelines they were using were letting them down, and they were not providing them with the support and the information they need. So there were 4 key themes that emerged as to why that was the case, and these related to language. So the existing tools and guidelines appeared vague and unspecific and very reliant upon domain-specific terminology. And they assume that web developers are familiar with accessibility jargon, such as what is sufficient color contrast, what is a meaningful sequence, or providing enough time, things like that. They're not clearly defined, not the sort of language they would choose to use. Another theme was the organization. So these existing tools and guidelines appeared quite abstract, quite arbitrary, and they were kind of unrelated to the people they were intended to benefit. So developers obviously focus more on the code and the techniques they need, but these tools and guidelines tend to be organized around accessibility-specific groupings that were just unfamiliar to them. Another theme was information overload. So these tools and guidelines presented an overwhelming amount of accessibility information, and they also presented a unreasonable, I think they call it unreasonable number of items for web developers to test. And they acknowledged that a lot of work was necessary to make accessible websites, but they began to say they just found it an unreasonable amount to get through. So these various problems manifested in a lack of confidence about web accessibility. There was an over-reliance upon automated tools. They just wanted to just get a pass, fail, just be told that it is accessible. They didn't want that responsibility for making that judgment. And also an over-reliance upon accessibility experts, handing it off to accessibility experts, the sort of silos of expertise. And ultimately, it led to the avoidance of web accessibility, which is the biggest problem. So this study gave me a good understanding of the problems that the developers are facing in creating accessible websites, but it didn't really explain their understanding of web accessibility and why these resources were so at odds with it. So, to explore this further, I conducted interviews with 26 developers from the UK and Italy. And again, they had a range of experience and worked for different sized companies and freelancers. And I was particularly interested in what they understood about web accessibility and whether they have a sort of mental model of web accessibility and whether that mental model is accurate. Well, it turns out they do know a bit about accessibility, but not nearly enough. They seem fairly clued up on the actual techniques and the code necessary. But that technical knowledge was based on a very limited foundation of knowledge about disabled people and assistive technologies and accessibility issues. Not all, but the majority of participants in this study were mainly just aware of blind people who use screen readers and the need to provide alternative text on images to support them. Fairly unsurprising, really. It's sort of accessibility 101, really. But what was quite interesting was that they had, well, the developers I spoke to appeared to have a very kind of development-centric mental model of web accessibility. So they had a limited understanding of the actual users involved and how they actually use websites. Instead, they sort of thought in terms of the code they had to produce to support the assistive technologies that disabled people use. So, at least to the web developers I spoke to, a screen reader or an alternative input device was almost like talked about like just under the user agent that they had to support, like supporting Internet Explorer or something like that. So whereas developers seem to have this development-centric mental model, as we saw in the first study, the tools and guidelines and resources seem very accessibility-centric. And they use this accessibility language and organization that's just unfamiliar to developers. So just some examples there. In WCAG, provide users enough time to read and use content. Make text content readable and understandable. Help users avoid and correct mistakes. All quite reasonable and true, but it's not immediately obvious to somebody what that actually means. And the bits they need, the coding techniques to address these issues, are kind of hidden away behind these rather vague accessibility-centric statements. Okay. So it appears that web developers struggle to use accessibility tools and guidelines because they approach web accessibility from a completely different perspective. And this explains why they find the guidelines and the tools quite vague and unspecific, because they're not really making that connection between what they're doing and who they're doing it for. So it just highlights the importance of a strong foundation of knowledge on which to sort of base accessibility guidance. Okay, so guidelines and tools and things need to address the misconceptions and correct the errors and fill in the knowledge gaps of web developers, but they need to do this while speaking their language and using terminology that they're familiar with. Okay. So to try and tackle this, I developed a prototype of a different kind of accessibility resource called WebAir, Web Accessibility Information Resource. And WebAir it's oriented to web developers' workflows, and it's structured around different types of web content. So it's structured around forms and links, tables, images, etc. And each category is full of a list of concrete questions for web developers to follow. For example, in the links category, you've got something like, can you successfully access all the links using the keyboard? Okay. And the language of WebAir tries to avoid any accessibility jargon and try and use web development terms or sort of user actions. For each question, there's a more information page that provides developers with a technical solution and also a code example and further reading, if required, links to further reading. And to avoid overwhelming the developers with too many procedures, each page contains a much smaller selection of techniques, which might not be as comprehensive in tackling accessibility, but it kind of reduces that procedural overload. So it provides these techniques up front and then gives them further information if required. Okay. So there's a screenshot of WebAir. It's not the prettiest, I'll admit. But I needed to have a sort of similar kind of palette to the WCAG guidelines and W3C guidelines for later evaluation. So WebAir can be found at the following address: https://www.cs.york.ac.uk/hci/webair, WEBAIR. Okay, and there's also a brief form on there for you to provide feedback, which I'd be very grateful to. As I say, it's a prototype resource, so feedback would be gratefully received. So, in order to understand whether or not those various sort of design decisions actually improved access to web accessibility information, I had to evaluate WebAir. The first evaluation was with 26 professional web developers and 7 student web developers from Italy and the UK. Again, a range of experience and different companies they work for. And the student web developers were master's students from the University of York. And in this, I gathered their impressions of WebAir and also of WCAG 2. Looking at the language and terminology and the structure and the organization and the amount of information and the number of items to test. And I should take this opportunity to point out that WebAir is not intended to replace WCAG in any way. It couldn't do that. It's a very different kind of thing. And I'm not taking anything away from all the work of Way at all. But I think of WebAir as a sort of complement to existing web accessibility resources for sort of training and educating web developers, particularly those who are new to web accessibility. So I'm pleased to say that participants were generally very positive about WebAir and rated it very highly. They found the language of WebAir very understandable, although some found it a little too basic and more appropriate for a general audience. So it's quite a tricky balance to get there. They found the organization made sense and was easy to navigate, but they struggled with some, particularly in the early version, some of the initial categories that we had. Like we had one called within page and one called between page and multimedia. Particularly multimedia, a few people complained about that. Somebody said it was a very dated term. They said it was reminiscent of 90s CD-ROMs. Anyway, they found the amount of information in WebAir was about right, not too off-putting. And they liked the option of exploring topics in greater depth if they had the time or the inclination. With regards to the number of items to test, though WebAir is much smaller than WCAG, they still found it quite a lot to get through. And the problem seemed to be that they were saving the accessibility testing up till the very end of development. So it makes it seem a very daunting task. It's still a long list of things to do. So all in all, it was quite a positive start, but I wanted to know whether it was actually any use for finding accessibility problems. So in that previous study, the web developers provided a lot of feedback about WebAir, and I made some adjustments and rewrote a lot of the content and renamed the categories and tried to simplify it and reduce the size of it where I could. And then I did a lab-based evaluation with 48 student web developers, and they used both WCAG and WebAir to find problems in 2 live websites. Those of Manchester United Football Club and the Pure Gym chain of gyms and health clubs. Don't ask me why I picked those websites. I'm neither a football fan nor a gym enthusiast, but they had a lot of problems in them. So again, participants were very positive about WebAir, and they rated it very highly. But the type of resource, WebAir or WCAG, made no difference to the number of problems that the participants found or how confident they were about them. So it wasn't a stunning result. On reflection, there might have been a few limitations to that study. It was lab-based, so it was quite artificial. It used these live websites, so they were very difficult to control. In fact, the Manchester United website changed on the day of testing, which was really helpful. It used students who weren't particularly motivated to take part. There was no real incentive for them other than learning about web accessibility. And they also only had 25 minutes with each resource, which for student web developers wasn't really enough for them to get familiar with things, let alone find many problems. So I'm not making excuses, but there were quite a few sort of limitations to that study. So I got real with it, and I tried to conduct a more real-world evaluation with 32 professional web developers from Australia, the Netherlands, and the UK. And I did these evaluations in people's workplaces and cafes and pubs, and some I did remotely via Skype. So they used their own computer and their own setup, and the hope was it provide a more realistic, more natural environment. And another difference in this was I built the experimental website myself, so I had better controls over the problems that it contained. And I apologise to anybody watching this who took part in the study. The website had a very annoying auto-playing audio of a crowd cheering when it loaded, so I don't want to bring on any flashbacks to that. Participants also had a bit longer to do the evaluations, had 35 minutes, which still is not ideal, but slightly more acceptable. And the results of that, again, rated WebAir very positively, and they found significantly more problems using WebAir than using WCAG. So it's a promising result, and it suggests those design decisions in WebAir are having an effect. So I noticed one peculiarity with WebAir. By making the language more familiar, some web developers looked at the initial question on the index page and sort of incorrectly assumed that they knew what it was about and didn't bother reading any more information about it. And then that led to them missing problems that they could have easily detected. So that's just something I'll be aware of in the future. So it's almost like making the resource too familiar kind of resulted in a false confidence. I'm not really sure what was causing that. Anyway, so on to my final study. WebAir, the design decisions in WebAir seem to be effective in helping web developers identify problems in existing websites, but I was also interested in how effective they were for helping web developers actually create accessible websites. I didn't want it to be a resource for web developers to use at the very end of the development cycle. I wanted them to use it throughout. So to evaluate WebAir in a more natural setting, I conducted a field study evaluation as such with 15 web developers from the UK and Australia. And I asked web developers to use WebAir over a 2-week period to create an accessible website. And I gave them all the content and provided a sort of realistic spec for them to follow. And I also asked them to keep a online diary during this time of their experiences. Now, I'm afraid I haven't got a lot to say about this one, as I'm still analysing this. But again, the results suggest that those design decisions have been received very positively by the web developers. It received some high ratings, and the websites they've built are on the whole accessible. So it suggests the design decisions are effective both in evaluating and creating accessible websites, which is good. Sort of glancing over the diary feedback, common things that they raised were they wanted more examples of best practice, more visual examples, more interactivity, similar to how W3 schools do it, with a WYSIWYG kind of interface. You can change the code and show you what's happened on the other side. Some still feel that WebAir focuses too much on accessibility basics, and they'd like to know an idea of how to focus more on the trickier aspects of web development, which is it's a tricky balance of where to pitch it, really. And lots of web developers have suggested some means of prioritizing the information, again suggesting that they feel it's still too much. Some suggested prioritizing it by job role or importance, like how WCAG does with the priority levels. Unfortunately, WebAir is still seen as a lot to do. But I think that's because, as I say, web developers are still thinking of it as something to do at the end of the project rather than integrating it earlier. Okay. So, just to summarize, that's just a sort of a whistle-stop overview of my research into why web developers are struggling to create accessible websites and what might be done to support them. Despite many initiatives to improve web accessibility over the last 15 years, studies have suggested that the accessibility of websites is barely improving, and in some cases is getting worse. There are various stakeholders involved in creating accessible websites, but most responsible is the web developer, I feel. And there's various factors that influence them, but the one that has the most impact appears to be the tools and the guidelines. And there's several reasons why developers struggle with tools and guidelines related to language and organization and the amount of information and the number of things to test. And these tools and guidelines appear to be at odds with web developers' sort of understanding and mental models of web accessibility. Then you get a lack of confidence about web accessibility, an over-reliance upon tools and experts, and ultimately the avoidance of web accessibility. So WebAir is an attempt to try and address this by presenting support material and techniques in web development-oriented language and organised around the work practices of web developers. So it's been designed with developers in mind. And the various evaluations of this resource so far suggest that the design decisions have been effective, both in supporting web developers to evaluate and create accessible websites. But there's one sort of caveat I need to raise. So the difficulties that the web developers encounter are only one part of the problem. And as my research has developed, I've come to realise that we need to focus on more than just web developers. There needs to be more of an organisational shift towards web accessibility that involves all those stakeholders and everyone responsible for creating accessible websites. And similarly, the support that may be provided by guidelines and tools and information, they're just one part of the solution. So it's important we don't become too checklist focused and too reliant upon these resources at the expense of acknowledging the actual experience of people with disabilities. Okay, so that is pretty much all from me. If you've got any feedback either on what I've presented today or on WebAir, please get in touch. My web address is davidswallow.co.uk. You find me on Twitter as David of York. And as I mentioned earlier, WebAir can be found online at www.cs.york.ac.uk/hci/webair. Okay, and as I said, there's a feedback form for you to provide any feedback, which I'm very grateful for. And there's also a paper out there that provides more detail about the sort of development and evaluation of WebAir. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Okay, thank you very much. That's really good. Let's see, we've got some, well, at least one question I've seen. Have you, over time, noticed a positive shift in attitude of developers towards accessibility? If so, why do you think this is?
There definitely has been, yes. Not just from my work, from the studies before that. There've been quite a few sort of in-depth studies of web developers, and one notable trend is that there's been a greater awareness of web accessibility. Not necessarily borne out in what they do, but the developers are much more aware of web accessibility and of the guidelines and WCAG and legal requirements and things like that. So yes, I think there definitely has been a trend that way. And over the time I've done my research, I've certainly seen that. And towards the end, the later studies, developers are much more clued up and aware of web accessibility than at the start. So even if resources and things are not having a positive effect on web accessibility, they're definitely having an impact on awareness, which is is a very good start. So yes, as for why, I'm not sure. I mean, it feels like there is more general awareness, and it's talked about more, and the guidelines and resources of the W3C and things like that are there's more advertising of that, and they seem more popular. So I don't know if that's had an effect, just a general awareness, and it seems to have sort of broken through more into web development and user experience circles, and a lot more awareness there. So yes, it definitely has, but I'm not sure exactly what's contributed to that. Just answer the question.
Another question we've got kind of internally is, just let me find it. Sorry, I should have found it before I started it. Is what in terms of the questions that you asked? I mean, what sort of questions were you asking of the developers throughout each phase? I mean, did you have a particular list of questions that you asked, or was it more kind of like a sort of conversation in terms of the questions?
Yeah, it was a bit of both, really. I'll find the list here. Actually, I didn't actually go into too much detail with that, did I? I asked them. Most of it was an open-ended interview and a discussion through the resources. And I also had a rating scale. I can't find my list. Oh yeah, there we go. So I was interested in usefulness, ease of use, navigability, and how easily they can get around the resource. Understandability of the resource, the clarity of the organization of it, the completeness of the resource, the amount of information it provided, and also the number of items to test, and their confidence in using it, and the confidence in the information it provided, and also their likelihood of using it in future, whether they felt they could see themselves using that. So they were the kind of themes, both of the questions I asked and the ratings that they asked for. Yeah, so yeah, it's quite a varied spread, but a lot of the information came out of a more free-flowing interview, really. If that answers that.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't think there was any other questions on Twitter. Ian, do you have any questions for David here?
I'll just check Twitter again, see if there's anything there. No, I think that's it. So good job.
Okay.
Very interesting presentation. Thanks very much for that, David. That was really good to hear. So I think that's it for now. The next presentation is on the hour at 11 o'clock UK time. So we'll see you there shortly, and thank you once again to David Swallow for his very interesting presentation there. So I will close off the broadcast just now. David, have you got any final things you would like to get across? Or
no, thank you for listening, and as I say, if you've got any feedback, please have a look at WebEx and please give me that feedback. That would be well received. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, Ian, do I just click stop broadcast here?
That's right.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.